The spot market for oil was surely one of the most lucrative ideas of the 20th century. Back when Marc Rich first began to snatch away a part of the global oil trade from the mighty oil corporations, crude oil cost $2 per barrel. In the summer of 2008, a barrel went for a record $140. Marc Rich's undertaking was revolutionary and highly successful. In the 1970s, Rich and a handful of trusted partners single-handedly managed to break the cartel of big oil, a cartel that dominated every aspect of the oil trade, from the well to the gas pump. They created the first fully functioning competitive market. They invented the spot market. Thanks to the oil trade, Rich, who came to the United States as a poor Jewish refugee boy, became one of the world's richest and most powerful commodity traders. He advanced to become the undisputed king of oil. The high point of Rich's power was soon followed by his fall from grace, a fall that cost the billionaire his reputation, his wife, and his company. Marc Rich is not known the world over as a result of his amazing entrepreneurial achievements, which were many. His name does not ring a bell because he was a unique pioneer of globalization, which he was. His name is not bound to the realization of the American dream, even though he rose from a penniless European Holocaust survivor to become one of the richest men in America by the strength of his own will. Despite his fabulous wealth, Rich lost control over his own name. Today, the name Marc Rich means the billionaire trader who fled the United States in 1983 to avoid charges of tax evasion and making illegal oil deals with Iran during the hostage crisis. Who is this man who led a life of high stakes and high risks? Who is this man who saw wars and revolutions not as curses, but as business opportunities? Who is the real Marc Rich? The man who managed to elude the agents of the most powerful nation on earth for nearly 20 years. Okay, so that was an excerpt for the book that I want to talk to you about today, which is The King of Oil, The Secret Lives of Marc Rich. And before I do that, welcome to Founders. My name is David, and the idea behind this podcast is very simple. Every week, I read a biography of an entrepreneur, and I try to find and pull out ideas from their life experiences that we can all use in our lives. So I have a lot of notes for this book, so we got to get started. But before I jump into the rest of the book and the ideas I want to share with you, I just as a reminder, this podcast is ad-free and independent. So if you get value from my work, please consider investing in the ongoing production of this content by subscribing to Founders Notes, which is now, not only is it all my podcast notes for on entrepreneurs, which by themselves are extremely valuable because it's the key ideas of hours and hours of audio, but I've turned that into a daily podcast. So if you want to support this podcast and allow me the time that I dedicate to it, please subscribe to Founders Notes every day, every weekday, Monday through Friday. You'll get an email from me at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Each day, I cover the main ideas from a different entrepreneur. So just like this podcast is all about my notes and highlights of biographies of entrepreneurs, my daily podcast is the notes and key ideas from a specific podcast with an entrepreneur. You get access to all my notes plus my commentary, just like this podcast is commentary about books. It's my commentary on their ideas. So you can read it if you want to, or you could also listen to it and read it at the same time. So that comes out every Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then you also have access to the entire back catalog, which I think I have notes from like 200 different founders by now. So please, if you do get value from my work, please subscribe and support it financially. I would appreciate that. Okay. So I have to get into the body of the main part of this podcast because this story is insane. And I have way more notes than I normally do. So I don't, let's not waste any more time. Let's just go ahead and get right into the secret lives of Marc Rich. So this is what the book hopes to answer. How did he and a handful of business partners seem to appear out of nowhere and go on to dominate global trade in oil and other commodities? What were the crucial decisions, the milestones in his unlikely career, and how far did he have to go in order to reach them? What were his limits? What were his greatest successes and his worst defeats? What drives him? and what can be learned from his entrepreneurial skills. Okay, so we're going to reflect back on his career, and then we're going to travel back in time to his early life. But this is just, I have to include this part because the historical events that were intertwined with the career of Marc Rich are insane. So let me give you some examples. Rich's is one of the most amazing careers of the 20th century, a career that is tightly woven with great events in world history. Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959, the decolonization of Africa in the 1960s, the Yom Kippur War and the oil shock of 1974, the fall of the Shah of Persia, and the seizure of power by the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in 1979, apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s, and the crumbling of Soviet Union in the 1990s. Marc Rich and his business partners were on the scene when these events happened. Marc Rich is the epochal pioneer of globalization. There's no way I pronounced that word correctly, by the way. The pioneer of globalization and an architect of the modern system of commodities trading. He is the inventor of the spot market, without which modern oil trading would be unthinkable. So they're going to now tell us a little bit about like what was the world like before this invention. So he made this invention before I was even born. So I've only grown up in a world after the innovation that Marc Rich created. And it says at the time, only around 5% of the world's oil was freely traded according to the law of supply and demand, whereas the other 95% changed hands according to long-term contracts at fixed prices. Since World War II, the global oil market had been dominated by the Seven Sisters. That's the name for the leading international oil companies at the time. And it says, this is how the author describes what the Seven Sisters are, or were, I guess. This cartel of multinational oil companies took its strongest beating from Marc Rich and Company. That's the name of Marc Rich, the main company. But I'll get into later how he had a very like tangled web of and a way to hide like a lot of his activities. And again, a lot of the stuff he did was legal, but he definitely found the value in being secretive. Okay, so it says they took its strongest beating from Marc Rich and Company, a small company founded in the Swiss town of Zug in 1974. It is as if a small software company were to suddenly wrestle away Microsoft's market position. In next to no time, Marc Rich and his 4 business partners managed to achieve what all commodity traders admire and strive for. They created a new market for products that until then either had been traded in very small amounts or had not been traded at all. So that's kind of the holy grail. And in a lot of entrepreneurship, actually, the creation of an entirely new market. So they managed to create an independent distribution system that bypassed the Seven Sisters. Rising demand led to higher prices for consumers, and Rich can be found at the very beginning of the oil boom that followed. He began trading modest amounts of Tunisian crude oil at the end of the 1960s. Rich also sparked the emancipation of the oil-producing countries. Increased competition among the multinational oil companies meant that producers could now demand more for their natural resources than ever before, and one of those reasons is because they had way more places to actually sell that oil. He says, less than 10 years after it was founded, Marc Rich and Company was the largest and most profitable independent oil trading company in the world. By the mid-1980s, we were already trading 1 million barrels of crude per day. Marc Rich and Company soon became the largest commodities trading company in the world, trading not only oil, but also all types of metals and minerals from aluminum to zinc. Okay, so that's kind of like the outcome of him going out and starting his own company. But I want to go back in time. So we're going to learn more about like his early family life, because they reference his family had to escape Europe. They had actually escaped, Hitler's Nazi Germany. And then we're going to talk about his first job. And, well, let me get into a little bit about his personality first, actually. So he says, I'm driven. So let me actually give you more context before I even go there. So Marc Rich was famously secretive. There was only like one picture for like 20 years. You couldn't even find a picture of this guy. And it wasn't until near the end of his life that he finally agrees to sit down with the author, who's actually So he's a business editor of a highly regarded Swiss weekly newspaper. And he studied Marc Rich for years, and then finally, after like a decade of asking, Marc agreed to be interviewed. And so we're going to hear a lot directly from Marc. And this is like these interviews and the time and all the research that Daniel did. Daniel's the author of the book, is the foundation of the biography. So we're going to see some direct quotes from Rich throughout the book, and this is one of them. And he says, "I'm driven by what drives most people, ambition. Mankind has developed through ambitions. Some wanted to climb higher, some wanted to run faster, some wanted to fly, others to dive. I wanted to succeed in business. In order to achieve his ambitions, he traded with anyone who would trade with him, be they dictators or democrats, communists or capitalists." Okay, so let's get into his early life. And this is, before I get into his early life, this is just him reflecting towards the end of his life, like, who is the person who influenced his life the most? And this is the answer, Marc's answer to that question. He says, "My father is definitely the person who influenced me the most. We fled from Belgium, and he managed to build up an important business from zero." He actually did that twice. "He then begins to tell me a story." This is now the author saying, "a story of poverty and riches, power and morality, politics and genius. His story, and in many ways the story of oil in the past and the future." Okay, so this is a little bit about how they escaped the Nazis. By May 8th, 1940, there was real cause to fear that the Nazis would bring the whole of Europe to its knees. And so David Reich is his father. They changed their last name when they came to America. David Reich spent virtually this is such a smart idea, or I mean, in hindsight, really, one of probably the most important decision that David Reich makes in his life. So he's seeing, there's all this rise of Nazism around him, this anti-Semitism around him. They're a Jewish family. And so David spends virtually everything he had in order to buy a used car. It was a prudent move, for Nazi Germany commenced its push westward 2 days later, so 2 days after he buys his car. He buys the car before the Nazis move. He says, "My father put us all in the car. We started to drive away. I saw the German planes. I heard the bombings. The German attack and the hasty getaway are his first real memories," Marc's first real memories. "The fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, the trauma of flight and loss of home were etched into the mind of the 5-year-old boy." This is actually probably important to his life, because he's always felt like very much an outsider, like he didn't really have a country. And so a lot of that came, like, some people might disagree with the decisions Marc makes, but he's pretty pragmatic, and he just looked at himself as somebody that just provides a service and never really got involved in politics. And I think part of that is because, he never really stayed in one place for a very long time. So it says, "Thousands of Belgians tried to save themselves that day by heading into France. Their escape to France saved the Reich family from the Holocaust. As the Nazis, I just did the Brad Pitt accent in Inglourious Basterds there. The Nazis captured Antwerp 8 days later, so that's where they were living. So his father had unbelievable foresight to get out, because 8 days later they captured the town. And I think they go on to say that 9 out of the 10 Jewish people that lived in that town were killed by the Germans. So then this is a little bit more about his personality. I was just kind of referencing this. "Rich would always be an outsider, someone who neither belonged to the establishment nor wanted to." So this is obviously not, he's not the only one that feels this way. I would say most of the people that I've covered on the podcast so far have this personality trait. It kind of echoes what Yvon Chouinard says: if you want to understand the entrepreneur, you have to study the juvenile delinquent. Okay, so now we're going to get into his first jobs. He's in America. And his father starts a jewelry store. And it says, 11-year-old Marc hung around and helped out in his father's shop. "I did everything and anything. I put price tags on the jewelry and helped to clean and sell it. The wheeling and dealing, the bargaining and selling appealed to him. It was there in his father's little shop in Kansas City that he started to develop an interest in business." And then he talks about what he learned from his father. My father had a knack for success and an uncompromising work ethic. So his father is also remained very open to different opportunities. So he gets the opportunity to sell his business in Kansas City. He moves to Queens, New York. And they just, we always talk about the value of niche businesses, especially in the age of the internet. Well, this is a hell of a niche they found. This is in the early 1950s. So he sets up a business, and its main activity was importing Bengali jute. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't even know what it is. Bengali jute to be used in the manufacture of burlap bags. The early 1950s was the best time to invest in jute. And this is why. And this is interesting how his father made some money off of when there's tragic events like war and such, because that's very much the case of the son later on. So it says the early 1950s was the best time to invest in jute. Troops from the communist North Korea crossed the 30th parallel to South Korea on June 25th, 1950, thus making the beginning of the Korean War. So the United States and 15 other foreign nations intervened, and the 3-year war offered David Rich, now he's already changed his name, a stroke of luck. The army needed a large quantity of burlap for making sandbags, and demand outweighed supply. Marc Rich worked in his father's office before and after school. He's a teenager at this time. The booming burlap business taught the teenager 2 lessons. Products can be sold for a better price when there is a shortage, and crises and wars can also offer business opportunities. He also never forgot how his father achieved his success. He made contacts, established trust, worked hard, was reliable, and adjusted quickly to changing circumstances. And he had no qualms about seizing a business opportunity when he found one. That's a pretty good one paragraph description of the career of Marc Rich. Okay, so he gets a job at this place where he's going to stay for a long time. And it's a small commodity trading house called Philip Brothers. So Philip Brothers is important to this story because he spends 20 years there. And he learns a lot. So he's learning the business of commodities from A to Z. And this reminds me of, it's interesting, I can never predict, I think there's interesting things in all these books I read, but I usually get feedback just randomly about specific podcasts. And one of the ones I've received the most positive feedback on was the founders on episode on Samuel Zemurray. And it was based on the book The Fish That Ate the Whale, basically how he becomes he starts off as a penniless kid that sells the rotting bananas before they rot completely, and then over the course of his life builds a company into the largest producer and seller of bananas. And anyways, the reason I bring that up is because one of the quotes I remember from that book that sticks to me even to this day is Samuel Zemurray says, there's no problem you can't solve if you know your business from A to Z. And we're kind of seeing that Marc benefited from working in the industry for so long and doing it literally from the ground up, which I'll get into in a minute. And it kind of, it's amazing how meteoric his rise was after. And I talked a little bit about on Twitter. If you're not following the show, you can follow the show on Founders Podcast. It's at Founders Podcast on Twitter. There's where I tell you which book I'm working on, and then I tweet out any interesting things. And one of the interesting things was, and I think I'll cover it, it's a note in that I have to get to, but in the years might be wrong. Let's say 1973, he was an employee at Philip Brothers. He's made $100,000. 1974, he starts his own company. The company makes $28 million in profit. He's got partners, so it doesn't all go to him, but still, you see the drastic difference. The next year, they make $50 million, and the year after that, they make $200 million in profit. Okay, but before he can do that, he's got to learn the business, and he was lucky because the book says he had the best teachers in the business. So this is Rich talking about his time at Philip Brothers. He says, I was working hard and long hours. Rich only had one thing on his mind at that point, to get out of the mailroom and start trading. So everybody has to start at Philip Brothers in the mailroom. So it says, after a few months in the mailroom, the traffic department was the second stage for all apprentices in the learning by doing system at Philip Brothers. So he starts doing well in that department. He was later sent to the docks by himself to supervise the goods being unloaded, inspect the weight and quality, and check the invoices. he finally began to handle the trading transactions. This is kind of similar to, if you remember the podcast I did on Mike Ovitz, how he wanted to get into the talent business and he had to start out in the mailroom, and then I think he wind up, it's supposed to take 4 or 5 years to progress, and he did it in 18 months. So Mark progressed rapidly, and we're going to see that in a minute. So it says, so Rich learned how to become a commodity trader from the ground up. And then Rich talks about like why he was fascinated, why he wanted to dedicate his life to this business. He says, I was fascinated by the size of the market. Take oil or aluminum. You can find those materials in almost any product you touch. The whole world needs them, from east to west and north to south. From the very beginning, he was an astute and knowledgeable trader. There was one main reason for his success. He had specialized in a niche product, one that in the mid-1950s was only traded in minute quantities, mercury. It's kind of echoing what his dad figured out, right? So it says, talk to commodity traders and sooner or later you'll hear an expression that is inevitably spoken in the tone of reverence: to create a market. I would say entrepreneurs probably feel the same way. A lot of entrepreneurs feel the same way. It is a trader's lifelong goal to match producer with consumer and find a buyer for a commodity that has previously only been traded very little. The capacity to analyze a situation thoroughly and recognize trends quicker than the competition. They're talking about like what the skills you need to do so. Who is sitting on a commodity without recognizing its complete potential? How do technological developments or political events such as wars affect the demand for commodities? Crude oil, to take an example, was processed for lamp oil and tar for centuries before its monetary and strategic value was changed drastically by the invention of the gasoline engine in the late 19th century. That's actually really interesting. To see the opportunity is the most important thing as a trader, Rich told me. At the time, mercury was used predominantly in thermometers, batteries, and detonators. Trading was consequently limited, and the prices were low. Having analyzed the global political situation, he had come to the conclusion that mercury would soon be in great demand. Now, keep in mind, he's doing this in his early 20s. I think he's like 21 or 22 at the time. When Rich started trading in mercury, all the indications were pointing to war. He called any producer who had the slightest connection to mercury in order to buy the stuff. He located his first source at the Spanish mining company, and the name of the company is not important, so I'll skip that. Before long, he had established a good relationship with producers and consumers and was regarded as an expert in the mercury trade. Meanwhile, the demand for the commodity soared, and the United States government, which commenced a rearmament program that saw the Air Force and Army increasing their stocks of mercury by over 50%. And as one can imagine, it says the United States bought these commodities in huge amounts. Rich was now the man to see when it came to mercury. It was his first business coup, and it earned significant profits for Phillips Brothers. So Phillips Brothers had offices all over the world, even though they were a much smaller company than Marc Rich and Company turns into. And one of those was they were doing business with the government in Cuba before Fidel. And this is right before the revolution from Fidel Castro, and they basically had lent the previous administration a couple $1 million, or excuse me, $1.2 million, because they're trying to mine this stuff called pyrite, and that was substantial for Phillips Brothers because they were at the time they were only making about $6 million a year, so they didn't want to lose the money. So after the revolution happens, they send Rich to Havana to try to get the assets to make sure like the Castro regime wouldn't just take it. So it says the 24-year-old Rich flew to Havana shortly after the revolution in order to negotiate with the new regime. So he winds up staying there for a long time, about 6 months, just trying to negotiate with them. And he's successful. He recoups he gets all their money back. Phillips Brothers, in fact, doesn't lose any money. He starts making money in Cuba. But the reason I bring this story up is because it's an insight into like how the mind of Marc Rich works. He's just like, people are like, how did you do this? And he's just like, it's pretty obvious to me. So he says, Rich analyzed the situation. What did Castro and his government need most of all? They needed hard currency. They needed international contacts. They needed jobs. Castro must want to continue production at the mine, which would both ensure jobs and bring currency into the country. Rich thus devised a creative solution that initially appeared foolhardy. I offered to inject fresh money. The Cubans liked the idea. It allowed them to continue with the mine, and I was able to recover the entire amount of our initial investments. So that's what I mean. He just, a lot of times when people are like, well, how did you, because in many cases, his company will have contracts with one one country, and then that government will be completely dismantled and a new government will be put in. And almost every single time, if not every single time, the new government continues to do business with Rich. And they're like, how is this possible? Like, I'm providing a service. These guys don't, like, they're taking over for usually, like, fundamentalist reasons, but they don't know how to, like, they have a resource, but they don't know how to make money on it. So they need somebody that does that service. I have the contacts. I can buy the product. I can find them a buyer. I can ensure transportation. I can do all these things. So why wouldn't you? So again, that's just how kind of look into his mind. So it says, despite the embargo, Rich never stopped trading with the Cuban regime. Rich flew regularly to Havana until the February 1962 trade embargo. Cuban business was subsequently conducted via the Madrid office. That's the office in Spain owned by the Phillips brothers. And it says the most important raw materials Rich traded with Cuba up until the mid-1990s were typically pyrite, which I could be pronouncing incorrectly, and copper. These were followed by magnesium ore, which was important for steel production, and nickel. So it's because of these two successes, the Cuban recouping all their money in Cuba and then making them tons of money in the mercury trade, that Phillips Brothers offered Rich at the age of 30 the position of Madrid office manager. Rich did not hesitate for a second. So that's another thing to most of what I'm going to cover here on the podcast today is about like his business. But there's several chapters of the book that go over like the legal case against him. There's an entire chapter going over like what was Bill Clinton's rationale for pardoning him, which is how I came to know him. I just knew that he got pardoned and that people were upset about it. But I'll share some of like the feedback that the author has, because he spent time interviewing all the parties involved. And, you know, this is 20-something years after this happened, because this happened in the early 1980s, and he published the book in the early 2000s. But there's a lot of stuff I didn't know. I just, again, heard about it. It's like, oh, this guy's trading with Iran. But it's not at all clear. Basically, the author leads you to believe that there's a ton of reasonable doubt. It was very unlikely that the case against Marc Rich would have ever led to a conviction. And he makes a pretty compelling case that a lot of the people that were against Marc Rich were using him as a scapegoat for their own political purposes, including like pulling up marketing that the attorneys involved used to describe themselves for other opportunities. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time there, but there is going to be some of that I'm going to add, like I'm going to tell you about, because it adds context to the story. But the reason I bring that up is because, one, I didn't know that he wasn't an American citizen anymore. I didn't know that his company was based in Switzerland. There's just all kinds of stuff I didn't know. And when you factor that in, you're like, oh, wait, this what got told in the media and assuming that the author, you know, is correct in his research, like very vastly different. So I'm always interested in that, where like what's in public and what actually happened, the difference between the two. I find that fascinating. Okay, so this is the dichotomy of Marc Rich, though. So he's in Madrid. He's Jewish, right? He comes from a Jewish family. They had to literally lose everything because of certain governments' anti-Semitism and the desire to kill them. So in Spain at the time, he's going to be trading with people who are sympathetic to Nazi Germany, even years after the fact. So this is the dichotomy of Marc Rich. And he talks about this guy named Franco, who was the, let's see. Oh, actually, let me just read that part to you. So it says, the fact that the Jewish businessman and the ultra-Catholic professor should become friends remains one of the paradoxes in Marc Rich's life. It is certainly surprising that Rich had such a great love for fascist Spain. He actually becomes a citizen of Spain and teaches his daughters to speak Spanish. So for this guy Franco says, Francisco Franco owed his victory in the Spanish Civil War mainly to support from Nazi Germany. So Mark's going to do business with this guy. So that's the dichotomy of Marc Rich here. He says Rich was not concerned about Franco's policies. Marc didn't care about it. He didn't care about politics, only about business and making money. This is one of Marc's strengths. This is these are quotes from one of Rich's old friends. This type of neutrality has proved to be an advantage to Rich's success in business, although some might label his attitude immoral. So that's where he just looks at it as very pragmatic. He's like, listen, I have no influence on their politics. I'm just here to provide a service. If they, and I charge for that service. So it just depends on how you think about that. Some people are like, okay, well, that's, pretty straightforward, pragmatic thought. Other people consider that, like the author just said, amoral, or even immoral. So it's up to you to decide how you feel about that. Okay. So what I found interesting about this time and all the, everything he was learning about Phillips Brothers, I think his work environment was a good training ground for his later entrepreneurship. And so I want to go into that, and then I want to tell you about how he thought about the opportunity in oil. So it says, Rich was lucky in that Phillips Brothers was not organized along a strict set of rules. There was no first come, first served rule, for example. Whoever had the better ideas, better contacts, or just better luck was the one who could make the deals. Displaying the same persistence and determination that would always set him apart from other traders, Rich set out to take on the oil business. Now we're going to get a quote from Rich here. Oil was a product that was moved in huge quantities and had a big value, but it hadn't been traded in a transparent and competitive market. I just thought it should be possible to trade oil despite the Seven Sisters. And then he summarizes his kind of modus operandi here. If I see a situation in the market and it makes sense to me, then I do something about it. Let's see. Okay, so I already told you that oil at the time was not traded according to free market principles. There's very little latitude for price dynamics, and oil-producing nations sold nearly all their oil to the Seven Sisters at fixed prices agreed upon far in advance, usually years in advance. So it says the Seven Sisters' domination of the global oil trade after the Second World War extended vertically as well as horizontally. They controlled every aspect of production and distribution, ranging from extraction at the well, refining, and transport to the gas stations where the oil was sold as gasoline. The Seven Sisters form what economists call an oligopoly, a situation that exists where there are only a handful of suppliers that dominate the market. They were able to dictate prices independently of the forces of supply and demand. And I just think that if you're trying to encourage more entrepreneurship, more people being able to do their own thing, I think you want to avoid instances like that where you can have these kind of fake markets that are acting independently on supply and demand. Okay. And he just talks about, this is now we're getting into his biggest invention, where he makes his most money and why could be is most well known outside of his legal troubles. And it just came down to, he really thought he was just the right person at the right time. So it says, Phillips Brothers had this German motto, and it translates to, it is better to sleep well than eat well. And so what we're going to go into a little bit about that. So it says the principles drummed into employees that it was better to avoid a lucrative deal if the risks involved were high enough that they might endanger the entire company. So they're trying to limit their exposure to tail risk, which is actually smart. In this respect, Marc Rich was more aggressive than his bosses, and it was this fear of risk, among other things, that would later lead Rich to leave Phillips Brothers in order to found his own company. I was the right person in the right place at the right time. I was working in a commodity trading house, and the oligopoly of the Seven Sisters was coming to a halt. Suddenly, the world needed a new system of bringing the oil from the producing countries to the consuming countries. So that's exactly what I did. Rich realized that if the oil-producing countries wished to break the dominance of the corporations, they would need independent traders like him. They simply did not have the means, the marketing know-how, the established distribution channels, contacts to the refineries, and the market of the oil themselves. Rich knew that he could offer all of these by utilizing Phillips Brothers' worldwide organization. He wanted to repeat the success he had enjoyed trading mercury. He wanted to create a market. It's very interesting that he's trying to do this within Phillips Brothers. It kind of speaks that he was happy there. I don't think he ever really thought about starting his own company. It's just I'll get into it right here. And what I talked about this on Twitter. I think the moral of the story here is you need to pay your talent. And so he gets screwed on pay and decides to start his own company. And so they wind up trading in oil. He invents the spot market. They make a ton of money, right? But the money is going to the company. And it says Rich and Green's going to be his partner. in not only at Phillips Brothers, but when they actually leave and start their own company together. So it says Rich and Green's trade in oil alone earned the company between $4 and $5 million of profit in 1973. Marc Rich did not earn much more than $70,000 per year at the time. With his bonus, it was possibly $100,000. After racking up such amazing trade successes, Rich came to the conclusion that $100,000 was nowhere near enough. He demanded a bonus of $500,000 for himself and the same again for Green. My request was influenced by what I knew the company was making, Rich said. So he meets with the company founder in many ways, like is basically his mentor for 20 years. This guy named Jesselson. I don't know, whatever. His name's not important. But the founder of the company just offered Rich $150,000. And Jesselson said he refused to pay. He refused on principle to pay more than $150,000. And so Rich says, so I had to leave. I didn't want to leave. I'd been there for 20 years. I liked the company. I always thought that the company would be my career for the rest of my life. But Jesselson got stuck on the principle. As soon as the meeting was over, Rich phoned Green, and Green didn't hesitate. I told him that I didn't reach an agreement with Jesselson. Pinky, his nickname was Pinky. Pinky did not hesitate for a second. So we're going, he said. That one telephone call would mark the beginning of the most successful commodities company the world had ever seen. Okay, so this is where I meant, like, there's a lot about Mark that I just didn't understand. And so I thought he was living in Spain at the time. He's also traveling everywhere. But this is the story of the founding of Marc Rich Company and then why he chose Switzerland as the headquarters. So he says, we all liked each other, and they felt that there was more opportunity to make money. To make money. This was a phrase I heard time and time again from Rich when he spoke of his own motivation or the motivation of others. Money was the prime mover. And then, so it says, on April 3rd, 1974, in the Swiss town of Zug, Marc Rich Company was founded. The 5 partners brought a total of 2 million Swiss francs in seed capital to the table. Rich borrowed money from his father-in-law as well as his own father. So that's how he's getting set up. And then I was like, why is he in Switzerland, though? So he's going to lay out exactly why. It was no accident that Rich chose Switzerland as the location for the headquarters of Marc Rich Company. First of all, Switzerland is politically neutral and in the mid-1970s was not even a member of the United Nations. Second, Zug is close to Zurich, one of the world's best, and thanks to a strong banking secrecy regulations, most discreet financial centers. Remember, he felt secrecy was a strategic advantage. So it's saying, okay, first of all, they're politically neutral. They also are very discreet with their financial transactions. And finally, it's a tax paradise with comparatively low income tax rates and corporate tax rates by international standards. In the mid-1970s, a mid-sized American company had to fork over nearly half of its profit to the IRS. In Switzerland, a company only had to pay around 10% in taxes. So when you're making hundreds of millions of dollars a year, that difference of 40% is massive. Massive advantage. With its policies of low taxes and simplified bureaucracy, both initiated after World War II, Zug managed to attract international companies and become an international center for trade and services. First came the American companies in the 1950s and 1960s, and Phillips Brothers was one of these American companies, the company he was working for. These were followed by German and British companies in the 1970s and 1980s, and since 1990s, Zug has attracted an increasing number of Russian companies. Zug seems to be the perfect example of supply-side economics in practice. The inhabitants of the canton of Zug had struggled for centuries, this is the interesting part, to make living from their dairy industry and livestock breeding. Yet the canton is today one of the richest in Switzerland. In March 2009, it had an unemployment rate of only 2.5%. Okay, so now he's up and running. And this is the remarkable first year of the company where he referenced earlier that he just felt, and a lot of times he was just at the right place at the right time, kind of outside of his control, and this is one of them. The oil shock of 1974. It was a good time for a commodities trader who wanted to go into business for himself. The world had been changed forever by the oil embargo imposed in the wake of the Yom Kippur War and skyrocketing oil prices. These developments led to the world's first oil shock, a shock that would have serious economic consequences the world over. It was a fabulous time for Rich and his partners. Marc Rich and Company was simply swimming in oil for which the U.S. and European oil companies were willing to pay a very good price. That's now a quote from Mark. It was a good situation for us. It was a shortage of oil, and we had the oil. So now I'm going to go over some of these numbers I referenced earlier. From the company's first days, Marc Rich and Company's financial success was nothing less than astounding. Remember, the year before, he made $100,000. The year after, in 1974, the company's first fiscal year, it had a turnover of more than $1 billion while reaping a net profit of $28 million. The company's profit in 1975 was $50 million, and it went on to earn what was an unbelievable $200 million in 1976. And then it's saying, well, how does this even happen? It says Marc Rich, well, first of all, you're beneficial because you have a huge amount of instability in the market you're just happening to reinvent at the time. But it's also Marc Rich and Company operated according to a completely different philosophy than did Phillips Brothers. It was more aggressive, faster, and more oriented towards a long-term contract. So Mark always talks about the competitive advantage of his company was speed. And I want to get into this whole... The whole time in the book, like so, you know, everybody we study on this podcast, they're human, which means they all have flaws. So as a byproduct of that, when we're studying their lives and their decisions, we're going to learn a lot of like good ideas from their experience that we can then take and use in our own lives, right? But you're also going to learn the shit not to do. And there's a lot of that in the book. Like, and I'll specifically call it out when we get there. But this is something that, well, you know what? I'm not even going to say anything until I get there, because just know that the whole time he's got some good ideas, right? So long-term thinking. He probably uses the term long-term thinking 50 times in the book. Agree 100%. I think more of us should be oriented in that direction. But what I realize is like, wait, yeah, it's nice that you have these long-term contracts when prices go up. But what happens when you have long-term contracts and the market's going in the other direction? And I've read enough about like financial markets and being fooled by randomness, et cetera, and I was like, well, sure enough, that's going to happen to him later. So just remember I said that, and we'll get to a story in the future. But the whole time reading this book, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, but it's only because the prices are going up. So anyways, we're going to get into that. So the partners recognized opportunities and followed up on them faster than the competition. They saw themselves as pioneers who were pushing forward into new territory, and they were interested in obtaining contracts that extended as far as possible into the future. Remember that. Ecuador is selling oil. Fly over there immediately and don't just buy the oil that is up for sale. Get the client to agree on a long-term contract. Turkey is looking for oil. Fly over there right away and sell it to them. Pinky and I, that's his partner again, Pinky and I flew to Houston to discuss an oil deal, Rich recalls. On the way there, we learned that Turkey needed oil. Pinky, who once lived in Turkey, instantly interrupted his visit to Houston and flew to Istanbul. He concluded a very profitable transaction. We were faster than everyone else. And then I just want to, right in the middle of the story, they talk about something that I think needs to be like explicitly said, because I didn't know, you know, I wasn't familiar with what it even meant. Like, how do you invent a spot market, and why is that important regarding oil? And so we're going to go into a little bit of that here. Thanks to the spot market, consumers were no longer dependent on a single company controlling a value creation chain that began at the oil wells and ended at the gas pump. Now buyers could purchase oil whenever and from whoever they wished. A large number of offers would soon develop, and a buyer could look for the cheapest barrel in the spot market. From an economic point of view, the spot market was much more efficient than the Seven Sisters oligopoly. On the lookout for profit, companies attempted to find a niche at some stage of the process and remain as competitive as possible. The result was that from the mid-1970s onward, oil was traded more freely, more efficiently, and at more transparent prices than ever before. So that's the important part. Tankers and refineries, the fixed costs could be used more efficiently than under the multinational oil companies and governments, thanks to independent oil traders like Marc Rich. Buyers for any possible surpluses could be found much more quickly, and supply gaps were easier to fill. In short, supply and demand could be balanced much more efficiently. The spot market brought with it an increase in productivity that helped to turn the entire industry inside out. Oil was now precisely what Rich had predicted only a few years before. Just another commodity. Marc Rich invented the concept of the independent oil trade. That is why he is such an important person in the history of the trade. And this is, I would say, Marc Rich's management philosophy. Rich did not put much stock in university education, but instead entrusted employees with as much freedom and responsibility as they could bear. We throw young people into the swimming pool. Either they sink or they learn how to swim. I would say either they learn how to swim or they sink. So it says, and then this is one of his employees who worked for him for 25 years. He says, he lets you do it the way you see best. It allows you to put your whole heart into it without any limitations. He leaves you to decide using your best judgment. I think that's the environment. If you're truly talented, like that's probably even if you're working for somebody else, like that's the environment you want to be in. They crave autonomy. And you can have that as an entrepreneur. You can have that within an organization as long as the management structure reflects that level of freedom that you want. Okay, so this is this is part of the like. I'm not again. I just said I'm not going to spend too much time on his whole case, but this is pretty black. Again, kind of black and white here. Remember, Marc Rich, he runs a Swiss company. He's a citizen of Spain, Switzerland, later Israel, and then he runs up renouncing his U.S. citizenship like a few years after he founds the company. So, but this is why Rich thought he was exempt from Jimmy Carter's executive order. And Jimmy Carter was the president at the time when Iran took the hostage. The U.S. They stormed the U.S. embassy in Iran, and they held everybody hostage, right? So Jimmy Carter's like, listen, I'm going to sign this executive order. It says President Carter's executive order, and basically saying you can't, trade with anybody. But there was an exemption. So it says President Carter's executive order excluded any person subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, which is a non-banking association, corporation, or other organization organized and doing business under the laws of any foreign country. So that part, organized and doing business under the laws of any foreign country. Marc Rich wasn't doing business under laws, was not organized, and was not doing laws under the United States. It was doing it under Switzerland years before this event happened in Iran, right? Or Persia, I guess. Whatever. Rich believed that his Swiss company was exempt from the order according to this definition. The spring of 1979 saw the beginning of one of the 20th century's most astounding business partnerships. Shortly after the revolution, the anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist, and anti-American regime of the Ayatollah Khomeini decided to do business with none other than the Jewish-American businessman Marc Rich. In the end, the new government, which had canceled most of the contracts signed during the Shah's reign, decided to trade with one of his most important partners. And this is why. This is now Mark talking about this time in his life. They respected the contracts. So their main state-run oil company there's the NIOC. They continued to sell Marc Rich and Company 8 million to 10 million metric tons of oil per year. As stipulated by the contract Rich had signed with the Shah's government. Remember, he goes back, he's like, I don't do business with people for one time, I do it forever, or over the long term. So he had a long-term agreement with what before was Persia and now is Iran. They didn't have any objections, he says. And this is, again, an insight into how his mind works. He says, as if nothing at all unusual about the situation. I had asked him how he had managed to gain the trust of the new Khomeini regime, even though he had worked closely with the Shah's government. His laconic, and that's a great way to describe the way he talks, answer helps to explain why traders such as Rich exist in the first place and why they were in such great demand. We performed a service for them, Rich explains. We bought the oil, we handled the transport, and we sold it. They couldn't do it themselves, so we were able to do it. And so the book also goes into, like, not only is the exemption of Jimmy Carter, of his executive order, pretty straightforward, but there was like American companies that were allowed to do this as well, and they list a bunch of them. Even defense contractors, because they had like different subsidies, or they owned equity in different companies that were located outside of the United States. So they wouldn't trade directly with an American company, but there was American companies that had interest in these companies. Does that make sense? So I don't know, like it's just there was just so much more nuance to what I spent nearly 0%, like no time looking into Marc Rich before I started reading this book. So it's not like I had a well-formed opinion other than just what was reported about him. But I find what was reported about him and what's in this book to be vastly different. And there's tons of examples of this too, where like, it's just like another, like, lesson of human nature. So think about what's going on here. This they talk about the new government in Iran is anti-Semitic and anti-capitalist, right? And let's say you're reading the newspapers around this time in 1970s, 1980s, and Iran, like they're just, they don't recognize the right to Israel to exist. They want, like, they publicly, adamantly, we will not sell oil to Israel. We do not sell oil to Israel. Well, one of the biggest money-making schemes that Marc Rich ever has is, like, there's a secret pipeline going from Iran, sold to Marc Rich, and they knew Marc Rich was selling that oil to Israel. And it's like the hypocrisy of fundamentalists, where it's like they have these beliefs that they espouse in public, and maybe they do it to gain support from a large group of people, but privately they all take the money. And that's what I find, like, so gross about, like, these people that desire to control other people and then are so hypocritical, because, you know, and they're also lying. So if you were alive and you're reading the newspapers, like, yeah, Iran doesn't sell the oil to Israel. They did. They were selling like 10 million, something like 75 million barrels a year. They were selling tons of oil to Israel and then lying to everybody while they're doing it. So I don't know. I just think it's like, this obviously still happens today. When you read the newspaper, like, are you actually thinking you're getting well-informed news? Like, what's the chances? We just know how humans are. And humans today are just like they were in the 70s, just like they were 2,000 years ago. So I don't know. I bring that to people's attention because, like, don't think, like I don't want to be naive and think that this behavior stopped happening. And at least, like, there's no way we can ever find out, like, the real truth of all, you know, the world's much too complex to do that. But it's just to be like, being skeptical is probably a good idea. Just, like, believe what you can actually verify. And when you have that kind of mindset, I just think that the amount of stuff that you can actually verify firsthand and therefore could probably believe is really small. So I don't know. Anyways, so it's, what happens is Marc is competing with a bunch of other, you know, commodities traders this time, and some of them, they snitch on him to regulators and say, hey, look at this guy. He's doing these, because at first it's like a tax evasion case, right? And then during the research of the tax evasion, they find all these deals with Iran, and then they make that as, hey, you're trading with the enemy. And so the note I left myself on this page is, this case is bananas. And I just want to be clear. I have no idea what is true and what's not. Like, there's just no, I'm so far removed from it, even after reading the book. I don't know. But I do know both sides are probably lying, and both sides did some shady crap. So it's just, this thing is insane. So it says the spark in the powder keg was a dispute over business documents belonging to Rich's companies. So the famous Southern District, the attorneys in Southern District of New York, which are involved in tons of high-profile cases, they're the ones that are going to go after Rick. So it says the Southern District had begun subpoenaing millions of documents from Marc Rich International after he got snitched out by these other guys, and oil companies and resellers in the United States that had done business with Rich. Marc, and this is the confusing part, and it's just like, it's just the very top of the confusing part. So he's got this other company called Marc Rich International. So Marc Rich International was a Swiss subsidiary with a branch office in New York that paid taxes in the United States. They comply with subpoenas. However, Marc Rich and Company, his main company, as a Swiss company operating in Switzerland under Swiss law, refused to obey the order. The company argued that the Swiss secrecy law prohibited the company from producing documents. So if you know anything about Switzerland, you know that the reason they're considered neutral, and they have, I would say, one of the most unique histories of any country the world over, is like they really demand that you respect their sovereignty, which I appreciate. I like, you should have the right. I mean, if you are, you're organized as a country, you have borders, you have your own culture and customs and ways you want to do things. Like, especially if you're not at war, like, why would other countries be able to come in and kind of tell you what to do? So this complicates things because this is like central to their identity. It says, nevertheless, District Judge Leonard Sand denied Rich's lawyers' motion to dismiss the subpoenas and ordered Marc Rich and Company to produce the documents located at the company's headquarters in Zug. This is crazy. When the company continued to refuse, Judge Sand ordered a draconian contempt fine of $50,000 per day until the documents were delivered. The fine was applied beginning in late June 1983 even though the Swiss government protested the decision with unusual vigor as an unacceptable violation of Swiss sovereignty. That $50,000 day fine, they went up paying I think it was $21 million or something like that. Rich refused to pay the fine until later. He secretly sold, this is again, why are you doing this, man? He secretly sold Marc Rich International to Alec, some guy, his close friend and one of the founders of the company, who then ran the company under the name some other name. In Zug. Judge Sand labeled the sale as a ploy to frustrate the implementation of the court order and threatened to freeze up to $55 million of Marc Rich and Company's assets in 20 American and European banks and other companies that owed his company money. Rich lawyers began to negotiate a resolution. Lawyers for both sides met in Judge Sand's apartment and discussed the case until late into the night. They finally reached a deal just before midnight. Rich agreed to pay the New York court $1.35 million towards the fine and to produce court order documents in Switzerland and pay off the remaining fines at a future date. The agreement appeared to smooth all the ruffled feathers, and it seemed as if the case would finally take on a semblance of normality. 4 days later, however, Weinberg's one of the attorneys that is going after Rich received a telephone call. A guy said, "This is Deep Throat." He called out of the firm that Marc Rich's law firm and warned us the subpoena documents were being shipped out of the United States on a Swiss Air flight, so that his own law firm is telling the prosecutor, hey, these guys are trying to get the documents out of the United States. See, this doesn't look good for Rich. Weinberg could not believe his ears. He cursed so loudly that his colleagues came into the office to see what was wrong. He immediately sent a few agents to John F. Kennedy International Airport, and the plane was already on the runway and ready for takeoff. The police were able to stop the plane only minutes before its departure. Thanks to the tip-off from Rich's own law firm, agents recovered 2 steamer trunks full of business documents. Now, Rudy Giuliani is working there. Many of you might know who he is. At the time, he's an up-and-coming lawyer before he's mayor of New York. It says the media-savvy Giuliani had the trunks brought to Judge Sand's courtroom as physical evidence of Rich's brazen behavior and immediately held a press conference to publicize the seizure. By this time, Marc Rich had lost all credibility. As a result of the incident, a furious Judge Sand ordered that all of Rich companies produce the subpoenaed documents by the following Friday. By Friday, Rich's flabbergasted attorney asked, "We have 48 offices worldwide." By Friday, Judge Sand ordered. So, I'm going to skip over a lot of that part because there's just too much unknown. But there's this whole war going on between the American prosecutors, Marc Rich, his attorneys, the judge, and the Swiss government. And the Swiss government, they would have, if they said, hey, he committed tax fraud, then if you would just follow our procedures, we'd do a provisional arrest of him and we'd be open to extraditing him. But the Swiss were very big on respect, and they felt that the way the attorneys would talk to government officials in Switzerland, they talked to them like they owned them and they were their boss or something. And so they wind up not complying. And then later on, they even call into question if they really ever wanted to arrest Marc Rich, because there was things like the extradition thing, memo or whatever that's sent from one government to another. It expired, and they never even bothered to reassess it or resubmit it rather with the Swiss government. And so I don't know who's telling the truth here, so I have no idea. So I'm just gonna skip over that part anyways because we want to focus on more of his business. But there's just a really good case that basically the Marc Rich's attorneys and the Swiss government saying that Giuliani and Weinberg were doing this just for political clout. They use that to get into publicity. Then they use that in turn publicity to not only get better jobs, some in the private market, some in the the mayorship of New York and everything else. But it was just a sham all the way through. So if you're interested in that, read the book because it goes into, there's several chapters where it just goes into all these intricacies. And again, I'm not an attorney, I have no idea, but they've got an entire chapter here named Rudy Giuliani's Failures, including an offer, he turned down an offer to have Rich arrested, and no one knows why he did that. Because in the public, he was saying, we have to get this guy. He's on the FBI's most wanted list, et cetera, et cetera. Yet in private, he rebuffed an offer to arrest him. And then a few years later, they tried to, the U.S., some of the attorneys, this is the weird part. They're like, it's a violation. He violated the law. We must go get him. Yet they try to kidnap him in Switzerland, even though that's a violation of international law. So it's just like, it's a wild story. Like this book is bananas. So anyways, I just want to give you that context. And again, I just want to focus on a couple other things because it's kind of outside the scope of what we normally talk about in this podcast. But it is a very fascinating, and I really enjoyed reading it because it reads like a James Bond-esque like thriller. Okay, so here's the personality. More about his personality. Rich is an acute observer and a man of few words, with a soft voice and a barely noticeable lisp. He is always precise and to the point. There is something this is such an interesting description. There is something cat-like about him, beyond his apparent 9 lives. He cautiously keeps his distance and waits. Okay, so I'm skipping over a bunch of pages because it has to do with like his like all the back and forth between the Swiss and the U.S. government. So this is interesting. So remember, he founds his business in 1974. He gets indicted by the United States in the early 1980s. But this is the state of his business in 1990, which I found very surprising. Even though he was pursued by the most powerful nation on earth, which did everything possible to thwart his business dealings, Marc Rich was able to continually expand his company until it became the world's largest and most successful independent oil and metals trading company. In 1990, 7 years after he was indicted in New York, he was active in 128 countries, had 48 offices around the globe, and employed 1,200 people. He bought and sold 1.5 million barrels of oil each day, more than the daily average output of Kuwait. He ruled over a trading empire with an annual turnover of $30 billion. The company earned anywhere from $200 million to $400 million in profits each year. That's pretty crazy. Think about the amount of leverage. $200 to $400 million in profit with 1,200 people. That's amazing. Okay, so this is one of his keys to wealth, where he talks about like what he feels is like helpful in success, and he's going to go into long-term thinking. And then he does this. Well, I'm going to go into like the limits of this of his opinion here. The key to success and real wealth is long-term thinking, Rich says. 6 months in South Africa in order to negotiate the purchase of a mine. 6 months in Cuba to ensure a loan is paid back. Advanced financing of a smelter that will not be completed for years to come. Such actions are nearly unthinkable for listed companies obsessed with quarterly returns. In some businesses, long-term thinking has been virtually forgotten. On the other hand, it is the traditional virtue of family businesses in which one generation always has its children in mind. It is my belief that this long-term way of thinking is the most important secret of Rich's success and can explain many of the strategic and courses of action he has followed over the years. Rich was always interested in obtaining long-term contracts with his clients. In economic terms, the development of new markets, making business contacts, and negotiating contracts cost a lot of money. Once a business relationship has been established, many of the so-called transaction costs no longer apply. The longer the relationship, the lower the marginal costs and the higher potential profits. Okay, so that makes perfect sense and works really well when the commodity you're trading goes up over time. Okay, so remember at the beginning of the book, it talks about like he was one of the richest people in the world, but he had to fall from grace. He loses the ability to go to ever travel to the United States again. He says he loses his wife and loses his company, right? So there's a lot to be learned from him, but a lot to be learned through his mistakes as well. So one of the most devastating parts of the book I found was that he had 3 daughters. One of his daughters gets leukemia. She dies at the age of 27. She's in a hospital in Seattle, and he cannot travel there because he'd get arrested the minute he comes back to America. And so like it talks about like he's on the phone with his daughter in the same room with the rest of the family up until the point where she dies, and he's just sobbing and sobbing and sobbing over the phone. So it's just, I could not imagine not being with your daughter at that time. I don't even, like I said before, I have a daughter. Like I just couldn't fathom that. And that's something you don't wish on anybody else. But it's also like the reason I bring that up is because the note I have on this book or on this page that I'm going to read to you is just don't be this person. Don't be the person that does this. Like, it's fine to have a passion for work. It's fine to have a passion for entrepreneurship. Like, it makes perfect sense. We want to be successful in what we do. Work takes up a large part of your conscious waking life. So you should be doing stuff you love to do and just, but damn, man, nobody is going to be on their deathbed wishing, I just wish I did one more trade, or wish I did one more thing. Like, no one thinks that way. Think about all the books that we've read, especially the ones where they're written by the person towards the end of their life. Like Phil Knight talks about, I wonder, like, if I could go and do it all over again. Like, he felt like his relationship with his son could have been better. Sam Walton, same thing. Like, I was expanding Walmart, but I did that at the sacrifice of time with my family. And no one's like, I wish I had one more Walmart. They're like, no, I wish I had a morning. I wish I could have had lunch with my son, or whatever the case is. And so this is his ex-wife is being interviewed. First of all, well, I guess I'll get there too, but like, they wind up getting a divorce. I'll get into that in a minute. But she's saying he was constantly working. It was difficult sometimes. His work was his hobby, and his family suffered as a consequence. Denise, that's her name, once complained to her friend that Rich made too little time for his family. And this is a quote from Rich. I don't have any time for you during the week, he told her. I can give you a half hour on Saturdays and 45 minutes on Sundays. Come on, man. That's not... You're not going to live a happy, fulfilled life at the end of your life if that's how you treat your family. You just won't. And it's interesting because even in the book, it talks about he's too busy for seeing his kids when they grow up. Even though he has he says they have a good relationship with them now, but like the author meets his family somewhere to go skiing with them. And Rich's daughters, the two that are still alive, are there, and like they're skiing, they're having a good time. And then when it's time for them to leave because they have to go back to work, or I think most of them live in America too, he's like, please stay, just one more day. Like, no, we have to go back. And when I read that, I'm like, oh, so now you want them to stay. Like, but what about how, like, you weren't even around when they were a kid. That's nice that you made a lot of money, but what? That's nice. You have $1 billion, but you spent no time with your kids. That's not successful. That's not being successful. Like, your kids are small for such a tiny percent. Think about even if you don't have kids, think about like your own life, like the time you spent with your parents growing up. And Tim Urban, the writer of Wait But Why, has a great blog post that I send to everybody and recommend it. It's called The Tail End. It's really a fascinating way to look at time. And, most cases, if you don't live in the same city as your parents when you grow up, like 90% of your in-person time is used up by the time you're 18. And that time, from a parental perspective, goes by so fast, even though it felt like, your childhood at the time, took a long time. At least feels like it went by slower than maybe it does your 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. And it's just like, why? Like, you can work later. Your kids are young for a tiny amount of time. And by the time, just like you, the reason are asking you to like look back on your childhood, like, your parents are extremely important to you, hopefully forever, but like, you become your own person. And then you go on, you have your own job, you meet your spouse, or you do whatever it is that you do. And like, it's just different. And I don't understand these entrepreneurs, or anybody. It's even people that work regular jobs that like make time for your family. It is the most important priority. It is what makes us human. There's a reason that you have this flood of emotion when you have a child. And this comes from somebody like, for a decade, I was like, there's no way I'm going to get married or ever have kids. Like, I came to that conclusion usually like based on like my family dynamics growing up. I was like, why the hell would I do that voluntarily? No way. And wind up getting married and having a kid. And I like want to smack younger David. Like, you dumbass, you didn't know anything you were talking about, because it's like the most fundamentally satisfying thing. And there's a reason why humans, like, we're drawn to procreate, to reproduce, and to spend time like molding that person. And the satisfaction you get is just, it's incomparable to anything else. So just don't be this person, man. You're going to regret it. Okay. So, and Mark makes a lot of mistakes. He's under a lot of pressure. They talk about, and I'll get into how he loses his company in a little bit, but like, he's getting pursued by the United States constantly. He's going to wind up making the largest financial mistake of his life. He winds up cheating on his wife with a younger woman. It's just like he starts drinking every day at the office. It's just bad decisions all the way around, and it costs him dearly. So this is the structure of Marc's companies, but with the mistakes I've just mentioned, his divorce cost him $365 million. $365 million plus breaking up his family. That's not success. Rich's company was a confusing network of over 200 private companies and subsidiaries spread over 5 continents. Many of these companies, all of which existed under the umbrella of Marc Rich Company, were closely connected with one another, whereas others were completely independent. A few of the companies had equitable interest in outside companies. Rich and his partners had originally created this labyrinth structure because it would allow them to both minimize risks and to make private deals without letting others know that Marc Rich was controlling the show. Now, the convoluted network of companies offered a further advantage. It was nearly impossible to determine Rich's wealth. And so what happens is he calls this one of his biggest failures. He has this affair with some young German woman, and, his wife offers to take him back because she was adamant about not divorcing. They tried to do that for a few years, and it doesn't work out. And Marc Rich, what he feared most was publicity, and now all in the newspapers all over the world, because this is happening after he's been indicted by the United States, is covering his very nasty divorce. Because, Denise was married to him for 30 years, raised his kids. She felt she was entitled to more. At the time, he's rumored to be worth about $1 billion, and he offers her $3 million. And that makes her go, thermonuclear and starts putting all his dirty business out in public. So Denise's father was actually a rather successful entrepreneur. He started the Desco shoe company. He always had respect for Rich, so he flies to Switzerland. He's like, listen, the lawyers have made this a big mess. Let's make sense of this whole thing. And Marc Rich really looked up to him. He actually, Denise's father provided some of the seed capital for his company, and so they make an agreement that they're going to give him $365 million. So $165 million of that comes from because she bought shares in the company at the very beginning, and then he gave her another $200 on top of that. And then what happens is, again, like the benefit of learning about these people's lives at the end of their lives, it's like they speak pretty frankly about what they regret. And I think us being exposed to what people towards the end of their life regret is, and you see the same patterns over and over again, it's something that we should, we need to benefit because we hopefully have many decades ahead of us. And what he does is he marries his mistress 6 months after he gets divorced, and he's got to pay her a couple, they get divorced soon after. He's like, oh man. So he talks about why they get divorced. Oh, because his new mistress, now wife, is too obsessed with luxury. What did you think she was dating you for? Marc, man. Marc is smart in a lot of ways, but it's just like... So anyway, he destroys his family, marries his mistress. Then she keeps asking for more and more luxurious things. Finally, he tells her no, and they get divorced. Then he's got to pay her another it says tens of millions of dollars, anywhere from $40 to $50 million for a divorce. It's like, even if you have $1 billion, you don't want to be doing that. And just, again, what is that? What's the example you're setting for your daughters there? Like some people, I'm not one of these people who say once you're married, you have to be married forever. No, there's and not to get too much detail, but it'd be much better if my parents would have divorced. They never did. But these are not good decisions. And I understand they were all prone to this. I make bad decisions all the time. I'm sure you do as well. But it's just, it's so frustrating when you deal with somebody that clearly had a very interesting mind and it just does this, okay. Okay, so now I'm going to skip ahead because I feel I've already spent way too much time there. It's a little bit emotional about all this. I don't know why. I probably do know why because I think about this in terms of having a small young daughter. Okay. Okay, so now we're at how to lose $172 million in one trade. So this is what I mean about when I was thinking, I was like, okay, long-term contracts make sense. What happens when the prices go the other direction? This is what happens when the prices go the other direction. A single bad deal cost him $172 million and took his company to the edge of collapse. It was the deal that finally forced Rich to sell his company. Please don't get the wrong idea. Now, this is somebody that used to work for Rich. that doesn't want to be identified, but is talking to the author of the book. Please don't get the wrong idea. I have the greatest respect for Marc Rich. I am what I am thanks to him. But this megalomaniacal deal also belongs in his biography. So he hires, Mark has this trader named Rosenberg who works for him, and Rosenberg wanted to secretly corner a market and attempt to manipulate global prices of a metal. And that metal is zinc. So Rosenberg and his partners simultaneously began buying huge amounts of zinc in an attempt to drive up the market price in the hope of obtaining a higher price for the zinc that they had purchased. When I read that, I'm like, why would you do that? So you're going to buy, like, I understand when you buy things, right, the market keeps going up because there's more people buying. But then they're going to hold on to it, stop buying, hope the market keeps going up, and then sell for a profit. That is an extremely highly leveraged position with no hedge. That seems to be to me very not intelligent. So it says by September 1992, zinc had risen to $1,400 per metric ton. They were buying and making the market go up. Okay. It was a high-risk speculative operation. Okay. However, they were unable to keep their secret operation under wraps. The trade press soon began publishing articles detailing this inexplicable rise in zinc prices. The artificially inflated prices were followed by a very real slump. So it drops down by over 25%. There was no way out. This insane attempt to manipulate the global zinc market ended up costing Marc Rich and Company $172 million. Not only did Rich lose a lot of money, but he also came out of the fiasco with his credibility severely damaged. His senior traders with experience in the metals markets had warned him of this adventure. So the entire time he's trying to execute this trade, he's being told this is a bad idea, and he ignores them. He says, this is artificial. There's no physical demand. It is a bubble that will burst, they told him. He refused to listen. And this is really interesting. It talks about like his mental state at the time too. You're drinking too much, you're under a lot of pressure, you're having family issues. That's why you have to it's very hard to be successful when you're not focused. And it's hard to be focused when you have all these problems. So this causes him to violate one of his own rules. He was ignoring one of his most important business principles. For Rosenberg had done nothing to hedge his long position. So he's completely exposed. So they lose $172 million. They have to liquidate before it gets even worse. And a lot of his key employees leave. And he's forced to bring back a younger trader that a lot of people had allegiance to, that wants to basically take over the company. And so because of this, he's kind of forced out. He's forced to sell his own company. And this is, I always talk about when you build something from scratch, you dedicate all your time and effort to it, and then it's taken away by somebody else, whether it's an investor or whatever. That's just got to be heartbreaking. So it said the takeover contract stipulated that Marc Rich would gradually reduce his majority stake in the company over several years. Management and high-ranking employees would in turn purchase Rich's shares. So that's actually something I didn't cover, but I think is important. Remember when I told you that he got kind of screwed over by his boss at Phillips Brothers, where he's making him $4 to $5 million a year, but they only give him $100,000, and they don't let the talent participate in the upside? When Mark founded his company, he solved that by making a lot of, even the secretaries would have share options. And that single company, I think, created more millionaires than any other company in Switzerland. I don't know if that record still stands. So that is actually a good idea you did. You want to not only do I think it's an aligned incentives, but it also all the gain shouldn't just go into one person. Okay, so it says, I was weak, Rich says about the sale of his company. It was as if he was describing a struggle in the animal kingdom. The old lion had been driven off by the younger challenger, and now the young lion had taken over the leadership of the pride. I was weak, and the others could sense it. So they took advantage. And this is the end of his time at his company. The value of Marc Rich & Company at that time was estimated at $1 billion to $1.5 billion. The company was active in 128 countries and it brought in an estimated profit of $200 to $400 million each year. It was the market leader in oil, metals, and minerals trade. As is the Swiss habit, the parties agreed to strict confidentiality regarding the final selling price. It's time to disclose this secret here. Rich could have demanded much more for his stake. In the end, he settled for the book value and set the price at $480 million. Mark sold cheap, one of the buyers told me. He winds up making about because there was a stipulation in the contract on future performance. He wound up collecting about $600 million instead of $480, so he made a little bit more. On Monday, November 7th, 1994, Rich finally sold the last of his shares in the company that he had founded and stepped down from the administrative board. The name Marc Rich Company, the name that had made history in the commodities trade for 20 years and continued to stir up so many negative associations, vanished from the scene. As soon as possible, so it seemed, the new owners renamed the company Glencore. Today, the company is still the world's largest commodity trader, and in terms of annual turnover, it is the largest firm in Switzerland. No competitor, no former employee, no spin-out has managed to become bigger and more powerful than Glencore, formerly known as Marc Rich Company. Nevertheless, there is not a single mention of Rich's name on the company's website, not even under the category history. He was purged. So I'm going to leave the story there. If you want to read the whole book, and I'd recommend reading it. I actually found this in a thread on Twitter, and it was recommended heavily. It's a crazy story. And if you want to purchase the book and support the podcast at the same time, just go to amazon.com/shop/founders podcast, and you'll see the 60, I think I'm up to 60 books, maybe 61 books that I've done for the podcast so far. It's like a visual of the entire podcast. It's kind of cool. They're in reverse chronological order. If you buy 1 or 2 or 10 of the books from that link, which is also available at founderspodcast.com, then Amazon sends me a small percentage of the sale at no additional cost to you. So it's a great way for you to get something enjoyable to read, well worth the 7 or 10 hours it takes to read, and a way to support the podcast at the same time. And just go back and any of the other podcasts. It's a good indication that if you liked the podcast you listen to, you'll probably like the book. Because, I can only cover basically like the highlights. There's just so much more to all these books that I do. Before I get out of here, just if you want to access, so if you leave a review and you screenshot the review for this podcast and you email it to me at foundersreviews@gmail.com, I reply back personally to every email with a private podcast link, and you'll immediately unlock, I think, 5 or 6 podcasts I've done so far. And I plan, as I do more in the future, you'll have access to that. They're just like regular episodes of Founders based on books. And it's a great way for you to help out the podcast because I need, the more reviews, the better it is for us. More people discover this podcast. And instead of just asking you just to do that as a favor, I try to incentivize you to do it by getting more podcasts from me that are available nowhere else. And if you're listening on Overcast or Breaker or any of these other apps, they don't have a review feature, but they do have a recommend feature. On Overcast, it's a star. On Breaker, it's a heart. Just pick, and you can be this episode or any other episode. Press the star, press the heart, screenshot it, email it to me at foundersreviews@gmail.com, and I will respond back with a link to the private podcast feed. And finally, please sign up for my daily podcasts. Not only will you get a mini episode of Founders every Monday through Friday, but you'll also get access to all my notes. So not only do I email you the notes plus my audio commentary on them, but you can log in and you can see, all the notes I've done on. It's got to be close to like 200 Founders by now. And again, this is just the key ideas. And it's very similar to what we're doing here in the books. Instead of me reading a book and distilling the experience for you on a normal Founders episode, I listen to a podcast. On this podcast, they talk about how they came up with their idea, how they think about the market they're in, what tools they use, what books they read, any idea that I think is very a good, something that should be spread, I include in my notes. And then now, because there's an audio version, I kind of add commentary on top of that and kind of expand out. So it's kind of cool because you can see the document I'm working from and you can hear how I kind of add to it. And again, it's a great way to support. It's only $10 a month or $100 a year. So please go ahead and sign up for that. And you can do that by clicking the link in your show notes or going to founderspodcast.com. And it's literally, that link is on every single podcast episode. So it's really easy to find. And if you enjoy this podcast, please tell a friend. And I will be back next week with another biography of an entrepreneur. Thank you very much for your time and for listening. I really appreciate it.